Welcome back to Jess of the North. Today's video topic is going to be the greenhouse build process. This is also the timeline for how the events went down. If you are somebody that prefers to just skip to the information, you can go to the timestamp here. And if you are wanting to stick around for the narrative prologue sort of experience, then welcome. I figured at some point someone was going to ask for details on the greenhouse. I have done a ClimatePod review where I broke down the pricing of the kit itself. This video is intending to go through the process of the timeline that I had for breaking ground, putting in the geothermal tubing, and how long it took to put up the actual structure. Now, I began the greenhouse build process. Technically, I began planning it in winter of 2021. However, the build itself began 2022, and I didn't start my YouTube channel until 2023. We were very careful to take photos along the way, so I will have several photos that I can just place up on the screen as we're chatting. I'm going to run through my explanation of how I arrived at the heating that I used. It honestly began with establishing what I did not want, what I wasn't willing to do. When you are looking at greenhouse builds and doing just a general search on that topic, there is a menu fatigue of decisions available to you, and it's rather exhausting. So I would encourage you to look through those choices and then discard the ones that you know that you're not interested in, and it makes that choice option a little bit less fatiguing and a little bit more manageable. So we'll start with the explanation of the things that I did not want or I wasn't willing to do. And that essentially came down to reasons of cost or efficiency. The first thing I did not even want to mess with was running electrical lines or water lines to the greenhouse. I did understand that there would be trade-offs in what I would be able to do without running electrical or water lines to the greenhouse, which sort of piggybacks into the next situation where I didn't want to try heating it actively, heating it in the winter. I didn't want to figure out what type of heater to use. If I used a radiant type heating, that would also require electricity. So those two things sort of go together. I just wanted it to primarily use the heat of the sun and the heat of the earth. So I was trying to think of what was able to meet those requirements at a bare minimum to the best of my ability. I saw in my searches a lot of really beautiful DIY greenhouses, but all of them seemed to have a lot of math involved, and that sort of scared me a little bit. I was an English major, so it's kind of not my forte. Can I spreadsheet? Yes. Can I math on command? Not well. Really not well. So I opted to get a greenhouse kit, and so that was my main three. Hey, these are the things I don't want to do choices that sort of set the tone for my greenhouse build. Since I did want to keep the greenhouse just above freezing, that meant that I had to decide how I was going to power a geothermal system, because geothermal was just going to be using the heat from the steady temperature of the earth at a certain depth. And because all I was trying to do was keep the greenhouse warm enough to handle frost hardy vegetables so that I had fresh veg in the winter, that was sufficient for me. It was essentially to circulate the air from the greenhouse, which on sunny days can warm up to 70 degrees, and essentially pulls the heat from the greenhouse into the earth below, and then at night rotates that heat back up. The 12-volt fan circulates the air through the 4-inch tubing, and the tubing is 100 feet long from end to end. So I thought of self-contained systems that did not need to be run to the house for electrical, and my first thought was solar. Admittedly, this is something that had its downsides our first winter because I did not account for how many cloudy days in a row I could have. It can be quite a few. If you've been here for any length of time, the renewable resource that I pretty consistently have access to is wind. And so an improvement point for me going forward is going to be that I would like to integrate a wind turbine as well, so that it's got dual power sources. So even on cloudy days, I very likely have wind. So that's on my eventual upgrade list. But for the build process, I like to just use a 300-watt solar panel that is connecting to a deep cycle marine battery. And I chose the deep cycle marine battery because it was able to withstand colder temperatures. Now, I tend to consume a metric ton of information, and then I percolate on that for a while and imagine it applied to the situation that I'm in. For me, that meant I consumed a lot of information that said some of the concerns with geothermal tubing in like early household installations involved condensation or moisture concerns within the tube itself. I understood this as similar to a hot summer day. If you have an icy drink, there's condensation on the glass. So that exchange of temperatures between the air in the tube and the surrounding soil can produce condensation, which potentially causes mold or other moisture-related issues. Mold and moisture-related issues are obviously something that I want to avoid, particularly in something that I am burying 6 feet under the ground, because once I bury it, it's really not something I'm going to be able to access to fix. So I got farm drain tile tubing, perforated tubing. It also comes with this really neat sock, which is exactly like it sounds. It is a fabric material that goes around this perforated tubing so that moisture is able to flow through this tubing and not be trapped inside the tubing. But the sock prevents dirt from essentially plugging the tube. This may or may not have been a mistake on my part, but it was an effort that I made to prevent a problem that I'd read about. So far, we're over a year in. I haven't seen any problems with the airflow through the tubing. I can always feel air moving through the tubing as long as the fan is on. So I think that so far is doing just fine. Now, if you are someplace with a higher water table, this might not be an effective solution for you. I am over 1,800 feet above sea level, so for me, I'm doing fine. I have a fairly high clay soil, but there's also some sand, so any water in my soil is not really blocking tubing either. I did put the landscape rock that we had ripped out from around the house. I laid that underneath the drain tile tubing so that it would prevent any standing water immediately below that and should allow it to drain down underneath the rock and just keep going. Again, so far so good. My initial plan had the tubing starting and ending at the same point in the greenhouse, and I had it tucked out of the main walkway so I wouldn't be constantly tripping on this tubing. But my concern was this tubing circulates the air, right? So the air at the peak of the greenhouse should always be warmer than at the base of the greenhouse. Additionally, because I water at the base of the greenhouse, where the plants are, that's where more of the moisture is. So it is cooler and more moist. So I extended the tubing for the inlet air to the peak of the greenhouse, a little further to the east, and the exhaust of the tubing I kept at the base of the greenhouse. And my tubing operates not only as temperature regulation, but as air circulation. So it is contributing to plant viability by keeping the temperature good, as well as plant health by preventing any of the air from stagnating. So my kit was ordered the end of May. It arrived June 6th. That was freight shipping, so I had to be here to accept it. That went perfectly fine. And weather was my primary, I think, delay in renting and utilizing the mini excavator. So I had my utility areas marked. So we rent the mini excavator and we break ground July 23rd. My friends Anne and Chris came over to help. My husband was also kind enough to help, and it made it much more of a festive experience. So not only were we all hanging out and having fun, but we were operating heavy machinery, which I personally thought was a good time. So between the four of us, we were all able to play with the mini excavator and dig down the areas that had been marked off for the main hole of the greenhouse. So that took all of the 23rd. We dug all the way down that we needed to go, so 6 feet. And the same day, we were able to lay out the tubing. I'm going to tell you potentially one of my sadness things for this is when the tubing went in, it was surprisingly difficult to wrestle. We did get it in, it's perfectly fine, but the layout doesn't match my like OCD preference for how I would like it to look. But it's in, it's 6 feet under. I'm not fixing it now, is what it is. Because we were renting a mini excavator, we wanted to make the most of the time frame that we had that available to us, which meant that the very next day, July 24th, we began scooping up shovelfuls of dirt back into the pit to cover the tubing. And then we would climb into the hole, rake the dirt into a more level pattern, stomp it down, which was helpful if you were listening to music that like has a good beat to it because you're just stomping the dirt down. And then we used a hand tamper to tamp that level and just kept that process going. So we would move in groups of dirt, rake it out, stamp it down, tamp it down, and just do that over and over again. Most of this project I remember being hours after work or on the weekends where like that's what we were doing. That was our time. Incredibly appreciative to my spouse for helping for this, as well as our friends Ann and Chris, because without them that would have taken way longer. I don't know that I would have been able to do this on my own. The next step was ensuring that we only filled dirt up to where I was going to need to pour the cinder block footing. So the specifications for the greenhouse came with the suggestion to have a footing that extended 2 feet down. We had just experienced a derecho, which are straight-lined winds, the previous spring, and so I was really on board with a very secure structure to attach the greenhouse to. But finding out how to ensure that where I put the footing was at the correct depth for the number of rows of cinder blocks so that the greenhouse lined up with where I wanted it to at the top of what was going to be the level walking path area, involved something that I didn't want to do at all, and that was math. Yeah. So I sent an SOS, and Ann and Chris came over, and they were very kind and helped me figure out how to do that because that was not going to happen on my own. So the cinder block footing frame that we would pour concrete into was installed August 5th and poured by August 7th. And then I had to wait a specific amount of time for that to cure. And then I dry fit cinder blocks to ensure I knew how many I needed on each row, and began the laborious process of transferring those with my super garden cart and learning how to mortar cinder block in place. That was actually kind of fun and satisfying. I would do that again, potentially not on this scale, but we got it done. Getting the cinder block in, not just dry fit, but connected, was done course by course or row by row. Also in the hours after work and over the weekends. The first row of blocks was started August 11th, and the final row of blocks was laid August 14th. I applied a moisture barrier, painted that on, put in a foam board insulation around the exterior of the cinder block because I had read concerns that you are taking the heat from the greenhouse and storing it in the earth, and there's not much to stop it from radiating out. I wasn't aware of a way to prevent that 100%, but I was aware that I could slow the release of that heat out because I want to keep the heat underneath the garden beds and radiating up as much as possible. So once all that was in, it was back to shoveling dirt and tamping. So much tamping. So still, no more mini excavator. We're shoveling by hand. Again, hours after work, weekends, that was what we were working on. We would go out, we would shovel, we would rake it flat, we would stomp it down, and we would tamp. In theory, it was a really good shoulder workout. In practice, I mostly just remember being physically tired and in pain from the physical labor. Like, it was a lot. But tamping was finally done at some point. Like, it has to come to an end, right? So tamping up to the top of the cinder block was done September 4th. So we broke ground July 23rd. We refilled the hole we dug September 4th. So September 4th, all of the ground prep work was completed. So the kit's been living in our garage for this amount of time. And the kit comes labeled as like the base kit, and then any extensions are labeled as extensions. I removed the base portion from those boxes because I wanted to line them up and make sure that it matched with the cinder block. What I neglected to do was note which of those pieces came from the box labeled base and which of them came from extension. And when I read through the description on the website, I didn't think that would be a problem because they read that they were the same length. In practice, they were half an inch off. So I had a bit of a snafu in that I put them in the wrong order. My little rectangle of the base was off a little bit, noticeable, but not so noticeable that I could point to which specific pieces were wrong. So what I had ended up doing was I had those two pieces that were half an inch longer than all of the others on the same side of my rectangle. And that is not how you make a square rectangle. And it's at that point that I sat down twice on two separate occasions and just sobbed from frustration. So I chiseled out the corners that were off, re-cemented in the base with the pieces that get attached to that cinder block base, and we were good to go. I think another reason that I sat down and just sobbed is because that was kind of the whole point in getting a kit, was that I wouldn't run into things like that. I just wanted it to work. Like, we'd already put in months of groundwork prep, and this was the part that I got hung up on. So that was upsetting on multiple levels. And I say this so that if you are going to go through your own kit purchasing adventures, you know what to watch out for. Potentially you'll go through a different provider and you won't have this problem. Potentially they all do this. I don't know. I've only bought one greenhouse kit. So again, Chris and Anne came over. They came over and helped put together the end panels. By September 11th, we had the first section of the base kit erected, and that was kind of a turning point for my optimism to be reinstated, where I felt like we finally made progress because I could see the beginnings of what I'd started on so many months ago. By September 13th, we had the roof peak going all the way across to the last end wall and like the main support structures. And by September 17th, all of the pieces were connected inside the main shell of the greenhouse up, including windows with auto openers. By the 18th, I had both doors put on, as well as the first two solar fans installed. The solar fans for the kit that I purchased, you essentially just cut into the polycarbonate panels where you want the fans. I had read that there was some concern that if your solar fan wasn't in sun, it wouldn't operate. So because my greenhouse is situated running east to west lengthwise, in order to capture the most heat in my hemisphere and zone, I put all of my fans on the south facing side so that the solar could do its job and they could function. So in order to be consistent about where I put those and the size I cut into the polycarbonate, because I was very afraid to do that wrong, I created a little cardboard jig, essentially, that I taped at the correct measurements from the peak of the greenhouse, so I knew where I was putting those each and every time. And by September 20th, the whole shell, including the windows with auto openers, the solar fans, the doors, all of that was installed completely. So September 23rd, I took what remained of cinder blocks and I dry fit how I wanted the beds to be in the greenhouse. And I made this a little more complicated than it needed to be, partly because that's who I am as a person, and partly because I did not want the full, like, 4-inch width of a cinder block to be taking up space in my garden beds. And I have seen people do really creative things where they're planting in the holes of the cinder block, and that's just not what I was looking for. I use my cement chisel, impact drill thing, whatever it's called, to chisel my cinder blocks at an angle so that they had the sturdiness of the base against the ground, but they were only that, like, inch portion of the cinder block itself that made up the side. So I used my skills I learned in putting in the cinder block footings to cement in my cinder block beds for the greenhouse. I started the chiseling project September 24th and was able to start painting those cinder block portions dark black as well. Because my goal was to use the greenhouse primarily for growing in the cold season, and when I'm in zone 4, that's like 9 months out of my year, I wanted to use something that would absorb as much heat as possible most often. And I figured in the summer months I could just grow taller plants in that southern bed that would provide some shade, so it wasn't quite absorbing as much heat in the summer and transferring that to the soil, but I would get it in the winter months when I needed it the most. I was able to complete painting as well as cementing in the garden beds in the greenhouse September 29th. And by the time October 1st arrived, I had successfully moved more of the dirt pile into the greenhouse beds, trying as much as I could to remove any weeds, seeds, or roots that I found as I was moving the dirt in. I planted crops that I was looking to grow throughout the winter, October 2nd, and then fit as many of my potted plants as possible in there, which turned out to be really handy because by mid-October we had our first frost, and it was a pretty intense winter overall. The snow did eventually melt, so that by the end of October I was able to move more dirt to the south of the greenhouse and create what is now the strawberry and chive bed that I've been also planting garlic in because I can. So that was the timeline of the greenhouse build process, covering a little bit of the reasons of why I made the choices I made. We've discussed running electrical to the greenhouse anyway. We'll see if that becomes something that we deal with later. Other potential improvements that might happen in the future would be getting the combination of wind with solar for my power generation experience for the battery. And then I think one of the other things I've considered doing is putting in like radiant floor heating in the walkway, which I think would also help keep the beds warm. That's something that is intriguing to me, but that comes back to how much power it takes to create heat. And I'm not sure that that trade-off is worth that expense in figuring it out. If it's something that you have access to that you've used with great success, that's really awesome, and I want to hear about that. If you've done your own greenhouse build and you've got it documented somewhere that you're willing to share, I'll leave that in the comments below. It'd be really interesting to see that. Now that I've started doing YouTube with greenhouse tours and garden tours when the weather allows, now you'll be able to come along with me as I do those greenhouse tours. I should be having one come out next week. So you can come along with me and see how the greenhouse performs throughout the winter months this year. But that's all I have for you today. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time. You can't have that. That's for me.